It's a great pleasure that I have here to introduce Jim. Jim Steer is the founding director, or one of the founding directors of Steer Davies Gleave and Greengauge. Yes, I just thought we had a new partner for the moment, but I realised Greengauge pretty well. So let's start off with the consultancy first. One of the most successful international consultancies that was set up in the 70s and has actually done a lot of innovative work since the more traditional consultants entered the field. I think that the company Jim has led has actually done a lot of work on private finance, if I remember correctly, PPPs, railways. So without fracking in too much more, there is that side to him. He's also, which you I'm sure are well aware, a lead sort of player in Greengauge 21 and the promotion of the fast train program here in the UK, and you never know, someone might be listening sometime soon in the next couple of months. But I've asked him to give a talk today on the area of our interests, generally speaking, mega transport projects, but more particularly, of course, in the case of rail transport, fast rail. So I'm not going to say much more. I think it would be helpful if very quickly we introduced everyone around the table. And then you'll know who's who. And those of you who don't know, but I think everyone does, apart from Harry Demetrio, article planning here, Director of the Centre, and Richard.
Richard Oates, I'm the Omega Centre.
Charlie Chen, I'm a future student studying theory of politics. Farina, PhD student.
Fieldwork Research Fellow at the Omega Centre.
Jenny from Omega Centre.
Correspondent. John Kelsey, I'm course director for the MSc Project Enterprise Management, which we're running for Network Rail, and also with 5 years on the time.
Reg Harman, part-time research fellow at the Omega Centre, confuse you, and occasional transport consultant.
I'm Tony Bolton. I'm the odd one out here because I represent the real world. I'm a member of the public, also a writer, commentator about various matters as you well know. I'll say no more.
Okay. John? I'm John Ward from the Omega Centre as well.
Hi, John.
Hello.
Right, are you happy with me sat down and talking? Because it seems to be set up right now. That's great. Well, I realise actually, well, I hope this will be the case, that this ought to be interesting material for you, because for me it is quite interesting. Well, how have we got to the position where there could be what you guys would call a mega project and the rest of us would call, I don't know what the rest of us were, I would call it a prudent investment. Others would say it is an unnecessary thing. So, I mean, really what I want to talk about mainly is, well, where's this come from? And why is it being talked about? And why, as Harry said, you never know. You might, it seems a little bit less likely with the current state of the economy and so forth. But you never know, you might have a go and say, yeah, I want to do that. So, that's what I thought it would be useful to talk about in an outline.
This is the center for the
Yes,
neural network.
That's right.
Yes.
Sorry to disturb.
No problem.
Well, there's a camera, so I'm sitting here.
Come and sit over here, be on camera.
Facing the camera.
So I thought I'd talk a bit about the motivations, and then to do that I have to explain a bit about where high-speed rail came from. And again, I think really the core of this is about what are you really trying to achieve? What are the objectives? If you're sort of inside the project, which I feel myself to be, you talk about that as being what are the objectives. I'd like to then just spend a few minutes telling you about this thing that we set up called a public interest group. I'll explain what Greengauge is in a minute. And just give you a sense of what's coming out of that and where we could go from. Obviously, I have a discussion, you can tear it all to pieces. And I shall learn, and you can get useful research evidence. I suppose this summarises for me the kind of realities that we face, and it's not often that you realise you better write it down pretty straightforwardly. And certainly in the transport sector, I think you have to be kind of peculiar not to realise the transport sector's got a very, very big part to play in the carbon agenda. You might choose to ignore it, but if you don't, then there are some people who will say, well, actually it's not really a problem, because all we've got to do is travel less. And that solves the problem. And that's a sort of taxation or restraint cars. We'll come back to that. I think also people tend to lose sight of the second point at a time like we're in now, because how can you imagine people wanting to come and live in a country which is losing value and wealth so fast? But actually, the longer term projections I've seen still project this country to be bigger than Germany by the mid part of this century. And again, you can say, well, I'd rather it wasn't or something, but that's what seems quite plausibly going to happen. We, on any international benchmarks, and Reg will confirm this, would find that actually we tend to have had less capital investment in our transport networks than just about any comparable European country. Now that might be because those comparative studies tend to only look back over 10, 20, 30, 40 years. But of course, the whole of Europe developed its rail networks and its road networks at much the same time as Britain. So we're pretty inefficient on any measures if you worry about things like efficiency. Our transport system's pretty slow. It's pretty unreliable. And really, I think it's quite striking that we make more use of private car than just about certainly any comparable size European country. This is a pretty, I think, uncontentious list of things, but there's a big picture that this kind of tends towards leading to, we have a bit of a problem. We also, the fifth point, have, and we're not unusual in this, but we just happen to be about the worst. We have a very unbalanced development picture. Now you could point to Italy, you could point to other, you could point to other countries, but anyway, we have all of those things. Of course, high-speed rail is hardly an answer to that lot. You could do an awful lot of other things. Most travel's very short distance. Rail, leave alone high-speed rail, is going to have nothing to do with it. But public transport probably is. I mean, I think I realised I was listening to Phil Goodwin the other day, who's pretty wise old bird in this area, and he was making this second point rather better than I do, but it is something I entirely happen to agree with. I mean, unfortunately, the policy instruments we need to employ are not really, most of them, in the transport sector at all. They're in all these other sectors which give rise to dispersal patterns of demand and so on. And of course, we could do a great deal with some of these challenges by sort of changing technology. Well done, President Obama, actually doing something in America. But it's quite interesting if you really think through the big piece of work that's been done in this area a year or two back. It must be 2 years old, because it was done for Gordon Brown, who was still Chancellor by Julia King. And basically what she concludes is you've got to convert the national private vehicle fleet. You've got to wean it off diesel and petrol. To what? Well, we'll debate it, but the only thing you can be sure you can wean it off to is some kind of mix of hybrid and electric vehicles, which would have some interesting consequences. But all of that stuff I don't think does anything really about long distance travel. You say, well, who needs to? Well, I've got to be giving myself a very generous definition of long-distance travel here, but you, people who know about transport, and even if you're not an expert on transport, really only need to know a couple of things about it. And the one thing you really, really need to know is that there's a very nice distribution of trip lengths, which mean the vast majority of trips are short and very few trips are long. So it's one of those, price on type of distributions. And you just challenge yourself on what trips you make, and you'll see that it's even true at an individual level. But, and this is the but that most people don't twig, although there are a very small proportion of trips are over 25 miles, they account for, well, just under half of the personal travel, measured as in numbers of journeys times length, personal kilometres, which is roundly half the carbon emissions in the country. 25 miles is an arbitrary cut-off, choose 50. The data is 25. If you look at how people travel over 25 miles, you might think rail, surely people travel by train. And true enough, if you're starting or finishing in the middle of London, they quite possibly do. But overall, it's still only got about 14% of all the travel at most, and that's kicking in over 200 miles. Typically 11%. And there are various reasons for that. If you think you can do something about that by sort of turning the clock back, I'd say you're in a bit of a dreamland, but unfortunately we seem to live in a very nostalgic world. We sort of think, so, if only. So I would say if you're going to do something about this, you're certainly going to need a pretty integrated approach. Look at the recent evidence, rail use is growing faster, has been since the mid-90s than car use, which is pretty surprising, but it reflects the fact that we've stopped expanding the road network. And I have to say there are no plans really to expand the road network. There's still not enough to calm down the lobby groups who are opposed to road building, because we'll still spend a few billion on that, keep the road lobby happy. But it ain't going to expand the capacity of the road network very much. There's no consensus at all on road user charging, or actually there is amongst in the professional world. There's no political will to do any of it, and there's no plan B given the sort of resistance that was encountered in Manchester. Of course, we've got a big problem with airports. I want to think about that as well. And we also kind of know, you might sort of argue about, well, within 10 years of recession, well, right, within 15 years. I mean, it comes to the same thing. We're going to have a bit of a problem. So really, if one was honest, and of course, everybody is honest, but you don't hear ministers of transport saying this, and most transport professionals don't bother looking at this, because actually, convincing yourself it's all just going to get worse is not actually something people trouble themselves with. Many people actually quite relish the fact it's going to get worse because they think somehow a magic solution is going to appear out of this. But more and more traffic, more and more congestion is actually bad on just about every account you get. Yeah, but the kind of response you get to this is, wow, we'll sort of people got all kinds of euphemisms for this. We'll have demand management's the generic term, but you actually can't do that without taxing. You basically got to impose taxes, and that's why, of course, it's called demand management. And of course, there are any number of ways around it. Say, well, we only need to do this in peak periods and times of congestion. Of course, University College of London invented road user charging in its glorious sophistication, shall we say. Well, you're either going to believe that we're going to move into a state of being in which governments can impose that kind of thing, because nobody's actually got close to doing it. Or I would say you've got your head in the clouds, I'm afraid. This is just time-worn. It's not that I disagree with it, I just don't think it's going to happen. So what I think we can do is we can do the demand management bits as best we can. You can encourage people by, really it's a glorified form of behaviour change program in a to stop smoking, travel a bit less, think about it, eat better. I was in that genre. We can, of course, adopt greener technologies. I'll show you a few things we've picked up on this. But I just don't believe it will happen as fast as the projections suggest. You know, think about the extra energy consumption of trying to power 30 million cars electric. So I do think part of the answer has to be you've got to provide some increased capability from the less carbon intensive modes. And if they're short distance, they're very simple. They're walk cycle. If they're sort of a little bit less short distance, they're buses. Do we know what the right thing to do in the longer distance market? Has anybody actually studied this? Well, the reason for setting up Greengauge was partly because, yes, they had. I was seconded to this thing called the Strategic Rail Authority, and consultancy Atkins and a bunch of others did some quite serious studies on this. And they looked at the alternatives. And it was really pretty blindingly obvious that there was a reasonable case for investing in high-speed rail for reasons we'll come on to. So what did they conclude? Well, and how did they do it? Well, when I got to the SRA, they sort of completed their work, so they thought, oh, no, hang on, this is no good, because probably your predecessors had managed to identify that all projects, of course, twist the truth. They all overestimate demand and underestimate costs crudely. Treasury sort of got wind of this. I think it commissioned Max after it had sort of read what the Great Dane had told them. It was dishonest. And so they sort of said, all right, well, we're not having any of that. Any of your filthy projects will surcharge you, maybe 66%. Whatever you say will add to the cost. It was what appeared in the Treasury Green Book. Interestingly enough, it didn't destroy the economic case for things at the time, so they also said we have half the discount rate. I dread to think what they'd do if they looked at it now, because presumably the discount rate is now sort of zero, actually. So you should do everything. Anyway, so I said, well, you better update this for the Treasury Green Book, which they did, and you better look at the impact of road use charge, because at that stage the then Secretary of State for Transport was kind of showing signs he might actually do something about it. So they did all of that, and they reached these conclusions. If you believe in these things, and we might talk about this, benefit cost ratios were sort of good, as they are so-called transport. And they reached certain conclusions about, well, what constitutes a high-speed rail project. Well, if you don't build it in the middle of a city, well, that's going to be expensive, well, yeah, but if you don't do that, there's not really much point in doing it. And sort of various other things around sort of options, like, well, why don't we just build a new railway, but don't make it high-speed, because that sounds, I don't know, scared. So they concluded things like, they looked at things like, well, we could invest in the road network, we could invest in upgrading the existing line. They looked at all of these things. It's quite a good piece of work. These are the sort of early ideas they looked at. I mean, if you're thinking about these things, they were given a sort of north-south remit. And you sort of tend to start doing things like, well, where are the big cities? Ting, ting, ting. Oh, there's a high-speed railway. Actually, you start to realise that it's not so clever, so you get a little bit more sophisticated. So, that's a little bit about my motivation, and I set up Greengauge partly because, as you can see at the bottom of that slide, SRA was wound up in 2005, and I kind of thought, well, I think I'd like to see if we can articulate the case for this. But what had actually happened? What had happened was there was a franchise bid at the turn of the century in which people were told, well, you're going to have 20 years to run the East Coast Main Line, London to Scotland. yeah, actually, if you want to propose some investment, that'd be a good thing. This was government encouraging the right ideas. There were only two bidders. The people who were inevitably going to win it were already running the route quite well. Irritatingly for them, there was Richard Branson, who's always worth a bit of a go at things, a bit of a flatter. And his new mate was Brian Souter. If ever there was an unlikely combination, there were those two. I remember Richard Branson asking me, he said, just met Brian Souter, what do you think of him? At that stage, all I could remember really about Brian was he was very anti-gay rights in Scotland. I just couldn't think. I mean, Richard was about the most liberal person you could be. I just thought, these two just can't get on. So of course they fell in love with each other because they're both sort of serial entrepreneurs. And Souter's idea as to why we should put in a really good franchise bid was because he really didn't want the guy who owned Sea Containers, who owned GNR, to have an easy ride. So they should have something to bid against. Richard actually thought he could win it, even though Sir Alistair Morton told him there's no way he could win it even before he put the bid in. I hope you're not recording any of this. So they put the bid in, and if you look at it, no, of course. And the bit, if you project things forward against that backdrop of growing rail demand, you can't think, well, this is going to run out of capacity. It doesn't matter all the tricks you can pull, you just not be able to. Well, why don't we propose to build a new high-speed line? So we did. The shadow of SRA, I think it was still the shadow, became the SRA, sort of basically, in the end, to cut a long story short, said, no, I ain't going to have a long-term franchise for various reasons. But Morton was, of course, closely involved with Channel Tunnel Rail Link, more specifically with Channel Tunnel. He was a mega project person. He's died since, of course. And he sort of quite liked some of this. So he said, we'll do a study. So he commissioned a study, I told you about that. I was finally got it released on the Department of Transport's website in summary form, but I have to say nobody could really understand what it concluded. You just can't really. It's difficult. For technical documents, that thing is a good piece of work. So anyway, I don't know if this is of any interest to you, but of course, high-speed rail didn't have a history in Britain, really. It did in France, of course, in Japan, well before that. Our line was, well, we should try and use our existing infrastructure. I don't know why you want to run faster, but if you do, you just make the trains run faster. Which was quite exciting. I remember travelling in it. I got the job of doing the market research on the passenger train, which centred on the question of being sick. So it was all very interesting, but anyway, got that. Sadly, this was great fun. Seeing people who really could design airplanes trying to design trains. Meanwhile, the French kind of grindingly progressed from the idea that a railway was a railway, and they just enjoyed tackling the problems in the way that they came up with. So they had a long-term high-speed rail strategy around the early 80s. What were we doing? We were carving up our state business, same thing in France, but we were carving it up into businesses. This was the Thatcher era. So it would be a good thing if you were looking jolly business-like. So one of my early consultancy assignments was, it was actually to write their intercity strategy. Various things happened. And eventually we sort of ended up with sort of tilting trains. And it do actually work. I mean, it's a very peculiar story, this. I mean, tilting trains don't really work anywhere else. I mean, you go to Switzerland, which is meant to have the best railway system in Europe, and everybody will tell you it's fantastic. And they have tilting trains that don't work. You want to see a tilting train fleet that works, you need to be small, not big and ugly like me, and you can fit in the trains, but they run on the West Coast and they are incredibly reliable in a way that nobody else has managed to achieve. Meanwhile, sort of conventional high-speed rail sort of kind of spread around Europe. So more recently, we sort of issued a manifesto saying, look, we should think about high-speed rail. Government basically decided something like that. Well, they didn't want to make a decision. By November, so this is only a year and a half ago, what was then, I thought, quite adventurously named High Speed 1 was opened. Big launch at St Pancras. Get the Queen involved, always works in this country, great wheeze. Combines nostalgia with engineering achievement, which the country had rather forgotten anybody could do. So that was a bit of magic, people thought it was fantastic. The department said, well, that's all very well, we're not going to do anything in high-speed rail. So we decided we would push the button on trying to set up a public interest group, getting some funding on it, and things have really kind of, we've crudely been overtaken since then. So for a period, as a little lobbying group, we were kind of making the case with, hey, what about this? A number of things happened last year. One was that the government ministers' team changed in the summer. And very soon after that, the Conservative Party, the opposition party, announced public sector funding. If we're elected, we're going to put in 15 billion, but they did this 2 days after Lehman collapsed, 15 billion pounds worth of public money into high-speed rail. So the government's starting to think, oh my God. Anyway, they had to make an announcement around Heathrow Runway 3. Very fine project, Peter, don't you think?
Lovely.
So they sort of concluded this would be a good time to confuse everybody by saying they were doing stuff on high-speed rail as well. The minister concerned, Lord Adonis, is a kind of bit of a can-do kind of guy, and he also thinks that the future's got a railway in it. So they said, well, we'll set up a government-owned company to develop a scheme, High Speed 2. Well, we, wittily enough, produced a report called High Speed 2 some time before, and we even sort of defined what it might look like. That's as far as we'd ever get to saying what it might look like. It's sort of pretty simplistic. A thick line is a new bit of infrastructure. A thin line is a service running on that and onto other bits of network. And that's pretty much actually what the government company is looking at. A link between London in the bottom, St Pancras, you know, just down the road. Heathrow, which we think is rather important in this, whether it's 2 runway or which is likely to end up, I suspect, or is expanded to 3 runway. To the West Midlands, Birmingham, and beyond North West England and Scotland. And we sort of said, well, okay, that's all very interesting, but really that's a first step. And the significance of that was saying, well, here's a project that costs only, with 66% optimism and bias, only costs 11 billion. So that's bite-sized, you see. Whereas the whole national network, you're talking about 40 billion, which was the figure floating around after Atkins. So we set up a public interest group. Basically, I went around with a bit of a baby bowl, talking to everybody I could bore on the subject. Said, look, do you want high-speed rail in this country? Because we'll do some serious studies. This lot basically got together and they put up between the £750,000 and we said, well, issued a little sort of prospectus for what we could do. We said we're going to study these 5 corridors. I mean, there's a question as to where they come from. Nobody seems to ever ask these things. You might. The High Speed 2 company, well, what's it doing? Well, it's run by this chap, Sir David Rowlands. He's chairman of it. He was the permanent secretary of the Department of Transport, so he's a mandarin, as they call it, for reasons you will know. But I do love this because it's kind of like medieval England, isn't it? Sir David talks to Lord Andrew. You know, sort of, probably you think they dress up in sort of knight's costume when they're meeting. Anyway, these days they write to each other or email something. And Sir David says, well, this is what I think we're going to do. And actually, the interesting thing, I suppose, to me in particular is what they said about the wider net. And they said, well, we're not really going to look at that. Okay, Lord Dunn says, fine. So, we're going to talk about objective setting. We've done sort of a bit of the background. The critical task really is setting the objectives. And we reckon that the critical thing in defining high-speed rail is capacity. Now, there's a really interesting phrase in here which sends a shudder down the spine of most transport professionals, because they've been taught over the last 15 years that the last thing you ever do in life is set out to meet unmet demand. That's a bad thing. Where you are acting as kind of loco parentis for the sole source provider of transport capacity, because eventually either governments listen to this kind of stuff or they don't. They're the only people who allow, you know, I mean, some years back in the 80s, somebody said, well, why don't we have a motorway going up the east coast of Britain? Yes, we could pay for it by private finance. We've got quite a long way to go. Had a certain rationale to it. No, we can't do it. I mean, there's only one organisation that can decide if there's going to be more transport capacity, even if it's in a city as big as London. Actually, if government says you ain't going to have it, you don't have it. But you're not really meant to meet unmet demand. You're meant to manage it away. Anyway, we think as long as you're talking about across the transport system as a whole, and as long as you recognise that, of course, you have to address the consequences of doing it. It's actually the main motivation, along with economic regeneration. Now, this is really sordid territory, because every transport economist on about page 3 learns, no, I'm going to make it page 4, page 4 learns that linking the centre to the periphery actually benefits the centre and the periphery, except under a set of very specific conditions. So this is a real toughie, because if all you did in truth was invest in better links, and you see the nature of links that are likely to go out between London and wherever you choose, might well benefit London more than anybody else. But there is this challenge. How the hell else do you ever get to a position in which demand chooses to, developers choose to develop outside the southeast? And then we said, well, we really ought to be trying to find an alternative to car use. This is obviously only going to work for longer distance journeys. And we ought to be trying to do something about short-haul aviation. And we, this all ought to add up to something that has, I mean, this last summary isn't good enough really, but it ought to have a comprehensive appeal. This oughtn't to be, say, just for business travel or for the wealthy. It oughtn't also to be something that only really benefits a limited part of the country, and it also ought to achieve a reduction in carbon. That last one's really intriguing, because if you ask the department, I'm doing this for the last few months on another project, to build in as an objective carbon reduction, they refuse to do it. It's not a valid objective. So that if you look at this government company, High Speed 2, which is looking at the London West Midlands, we have to do this fairly quickly, but if you look at they've got some objectives on the left-hand side there. They look fairly simple. But actually, they're saying, well, we want to increase capacity of the rail network. Well, I don't really understand that. I mean, this has got to be the capacity of the national transport system. Of course, high-speed rail is a rail problem. But they should be looking at the problems we think across the rail network. Speed, well, speed delivers some of these other things. Great. We talk to them about land use and development. They talk about, well, we'll need to look at housing growth between London and Birmingham. That's the wider south east. nothing beyond that. A bit about freight, and they're very odd on the subject of modal shift from car. They seem to think that's sort of somehow relevant in the Thames Valley. And they don't expect any modal shift from there. So, I mean, I think what's the thought of it here? I think what it comes down to is we think this is an intervention that's got to address some wider economic and environmental objectives, really to make any sense. And it does that by providing capacity, which really got to be thought about across the modes. We're certainly in the department, and they always send back to me and say, well, no, we agree there's a capacity problem for rail. Well, look at high-speed rail against all the other ways of increasing the capacity of the rail network. Well, then it's the wrong problem set. But, you know, government has this thing of only taking one challenge at a time. So if you read the Eddington report on the subject of high-speed rail, which Sir Rod Blessing didn't write, it was written by a Treasury departmental team, and say, well, you know, we looked at the environmental benefits of high-speed rail, and indeed they could be quite significant, but they don't represent a reason for doing high-speed rail. Possibly on their own. Anyway, this is just briefly something I'm going to finish in a second. This is across the bottom: 2008, 2025, 2040, 2055. This is carbon emissions per seat kilometre. And the purple line bar is air. High-speed rail is pink, and car is blue or white. And the interesting thing is, I'll just take the other modes, just take the air mode. If you look at all the things that can be done with aviation, you can kind of halve the carbon emissions by 2055. If you look at all the things you can do with car, as projected in the King Review, which is the blue bar, you get from 30 grams of carbon per seat kilometre down to about 1. You could transform it. You have to assume you've got nuclear or totally renewable energy supply, electricity supply, but you can see it dropping down. If you take a slightly more cautious view about how that goes, you end up with that one, which gets it down from about 30 grams down to about 20. And even that is going somewhere, I have to say. That's certainly way ahead of recent trajectories. If you look at high-speed rail, it's obviously it's a lot less than air. It's not a hell of a lot less than car. But it will be over the next 20, 30 years. And one of the reasons is the underlying assumption in this analysis, which after all gives you that very low score for car in future, is that the electricity supply industry has to change consistent with government plans. There's risk around that. But the carbon credentials of this way of travel are significant. And you say, well, yeah, but wouldn't ordinary speed rail be even better than that pink bar? And the answer is it might be. It might not, because there's quite a lot of work that shows that if you build a new piece of infrastructure designed for faster speeds, you'll get very good energy efficiency out of it, especially if you design the rolling stock to match. But of course what you won't get with conventional speed is the diversion away from these less carbon-friendly modes of travel. You are in a marketplace. You've actually got to attract people to stop doing these things. You can go back to that bit of area of delusion I had at the beginning, which just said, no, I'll just stop and I'll just ban all flights. I'll close Heathrow. I'll glance over the motorways, as Branson once said. Ain't gonna happen. Anyway, we're looking at some network shapes. Shows you the early slide. Nothing new. I mean, these things fall out, really. So what do you conclude? I'm certainly not pretending high-speed rail as a solution to everything, but it could certainly eliminate the need for an awful lot of short-haul aviation. I think a big question is, with no doubt some complementary measures, can it really do what happened in the 1950s when the then Minister of Transport, who also happened to run a major civil engineering company, amusingly enough, they got a lot of business out of this, decided the country should belatedly have a national motorway network, sold to the nation on the back of the fact that in future everybody will have a family car, because in the 1950s very few people did have it. And this is what you will drive on. Pictures of nice big 6-lane roads with 3 cars. And people bought it. And the national motorway network, of course this predates environmentalism, but there were still people who didn't like it. But it was recognised to be the future. So I think high-speed rail in the sense has got to be, and I certainly don't think it is at the moment. I think it's seen as being something that people who need to go to Paris for a weekend, as we all do. No, rich people in London need to travel on it. And that's what it's seen as at the moment. That's not what it's. Will it bring a stimulus to the regional economies? Will it really reduce carbon? Can we afford to do it? Some questions. Those are my answers. So there we go.
Okay. Questions, comments, elaborations? No point being shy here, guys.
I'm going to say, if nobody else is going to say anything, I should know Jim really heard my voice on this at the old point. I was fascinated, by sort of raising this point about varying objectives and so on. I think one thing, one of the big things with Omega is context. In a way, one of the other things I can see with the French, say, the Dutch, by the way, I go along totally with your comments on car dominance and low investments, is that they actually have a degree of national strategies and a nationally cohesive way, in a perfect way, they're political places, they're other places, of doing these things. So there's almost a structure, a framework. So anything, high-speed rail, trams, post, it's the opportunity, these things, to plug in, be used, and get their place, in fact, develop. And in fact, it's the lack of context and so on is one of the biggest issues that as you've indicated in some ways, is actually one of the biggest problems we face, and it spreads across a number of other things which we can talk about again, which you've dealt with anyway.
Well, I think it's a problem, but I suppose you could say that across the whole scale of things, if we were to sit around and wait for it, we would just, there would just be a continuity of poor ad hoc decision making. So, but you're right. I guess what I would say is that some of the apparatus that goes with good strategic coherent planning, I think we have to force people into applying. I think that comes from thinking really widely across the piece and getting outside of a narrow box of rail or transport.
I'm more interested about what is the spatial economic impact of high-speed train in a regional scale.
Yeah.
So whether this kind of high-speed train linkage can help to improve, reverse this kind of uneven development between the north and the south. I read your manifesto.
Manifesto is a good word.
And I think the expectation of this high-speed train investment would be like how to expand the very moving development around London, and how to solve some current problem around London, and then to redistribute this kind of the development to the northern city or Midland city. But it means that how to expand the catchment, according to my understanding, how to expand the catchment of London area to the north or the Midland cities. But it seems to me that if this happens in the future, can we have a more even development, or we will have a bigger region, or probably the whole England, will be a very big region, bigger than now the South England, Southeast, this region. And the second one is, if we don't have a stronger economic development around the northern cities, some other economic activities, other than just investment of all the infrastructure to the north, can it just, because of the direct linkage, can it just be like just prevent this kind of the decline in the north, just prevent it become worse, but actually could not really redistribute the development to the north cities. So that's my question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of people in this room who probably can give you some good answers to this. My view for what it's worth is that on its own, it won't do it. And that what you need is not actually the sort of national transport planning framework that Rich calls worthy that it might be. But you do need some complementary policy measures that really say, well, actually, we're not just going. I mean, there is a national government target, there's targets for everything, but there is a target to reduce the disparities in economic productivity. We're aware of that. But because it's there alongside 47 other targets, it doesn't really mean anything, and nobody's really worried, in truth. If they're not there, they say, well, I have 46 other things to do. And it's probably better than it would have been if we didn't recognise it as a target. You'd have to do an awful lot better than that. You'd actually have to believe you wanted to do this. And I don't believe that the country does at present. And it only will get to a position by being prepared to think a little bit more forward about. Well, it's a shame how fast this century is going. I mean, a few years back, you could sort of say, hey, think about the century ahead. Damn it, we've used up 9 years and made a bit of a mess of it. But it's that kind of spirit that I think you have to have. I guess that the credit crunch might change things a little bit, because I think people have lost the confidence in London, in truth, as an economic driver. Again, you're not meant to go around saying that. This is things even worse if you do. But I mean, what's the future of the financial core of London? It's not the only thing London has, but is it quite the way it was? Of course, a lot of people just want to reassemble. I mean, the rest of the country has none of that. I mean, if you're running talking to the people who run a very big research, biochem research up in Cheshire. And it's about offshoot businesses. Where do you get financial services advice from? You're quite near Manchester and London. And that's where all those transactions take place. But it's a bit wishful thinking to presume just better links to London are going to make it easier to stimulate investment in the north. It would be very hit and miss, absolutely. But, setting up this public interest group was quite consciously trying to draw in people who would really worry about it. If you go and talk to the leaders of the city councils, it varies a bit. I'm really keen on this. Why are they really keen? And not because they're great train lovers, they want to regenerate the cities.
I think there's a read across, as the civil servants have said, between these two questions Jimmy asked, because one could argue that a high-speed line won't do anything in itself, but it might do something if it were consciously related to a set of other actions. For instance, the northern core cities are terribly interested in our area, higher education, setting themselves up as major science cities, yes, in rivalry to the Oxford, Cambridge, UCL Imperial axis. And this could help attract scientific investment up there. Or an even more obvious example, part of the BBC moving and the attempt to create a media city up there. It obviously will help media a city to have even 3 trains an hour running at 200 kilometres an hour. But he took the decision to move that part of the BBC. So this suggests you need to put these together, Dave said, with some kind of national spatial strategy, which the government has consistently rejected. But worse than this, in the DFT, you get this silo mentality when you go in there, and you have a head of rail. I was talking to the guy, you must talk to him all the time. And there's a head of air, and so on and so forth.
Yes, that's not airhead.
Not necessarily airhead. Then you get the extraordinary situation where the government says, okay, we'll have national infrastructure statements, and we'll certainly have one for energy. And where's the transport infrastructure? Oh, that's an airport's transport infrastructure, a rail transport infrastructure, all considered completely separately. And by the way, the air strategy has already been determined in the white paper 5 years ago. Nothing's changed since then, of course. Yeah. So you get this silo mentality inside the department that can't even relate one bit of transport to another. So it can't do what you want to do.
And let's be really depressing. And who sees the department? Sees his big rival and the person who should never be satiated as being whatever the Department of Environment or DCRG is called this. Yeah. I mean, they are people not to be dealt with.
I mean, do we really want to go on and talk about the dead hand of the Treasury?
We get too cheerful.
There'll
be no mega projects to study if you're going on like this.
This is coming out. I think it's it's not something surprising. It's coming out from our CTRL research. I know these might be one of those quotes, but the dead hand of the Treasury is part of the reason why short-termism is alive, kicking well, let alone the silent thinking of these other people. But can I just ask a couple of other questions? To what extent, because this has to do with vision, as you've implied throughout, to what extent is there a vision for railway to play a major role in freight movement? And to what extent does, if there is that kind of vision, is the rail network that you're looking to going to be like the French, ultimately nuclear driven in its power source? You did make the issue that at the end of the day, there's an energy issue behind all this. Just two questions.
Well, the freight issue is quite difficult. The truth of the matter is, rail freight is rail attracts at very specific parts of the overall freight and logistics industry. I mean, most of the trucks you see on the road are kind of shipping FCMG goods around, consumer durables around. They're part of the retail system, submarine construction, of course, and so on. The railways have never made any serious inroad into fast-moving consumer goods. I mean, there's one train a day, runs from the South Midlands to Glasgow. Ships, and outworks on the basis of it's shipping food, basically, from the middle of England to central Scotland, and then it carries bottled water back. So it's very good business. You'd have a pipeline, it'd be a lot easier. And that's about it. I mean, and then of course they're shipping a lot of containers at ports and all the rest of it. Clearly, you could do an awful lot better. And I tend to have a lot of sympathy with the guy who heads the biggest freight company, which is now owned by German Railways, of course, which is, the big problem really is London, because you can't run a freight train across London. And there's lots of railways, but they're full of commuter trains. And for 6 hours a day, no freight train should move, basically. And there is no identified project to tackle that. In fact, there are projects that will make it worse than across train. So
it's not part of the vision at all.
So, well, it isn't part of anybody's vision, but I do think it's a very, very serious issue. And we've got the Rail Freight Group, we've kind of signed them up mainly candidly, because otherwise they'll spend their time telling us this is a waste of time. But we can create at a high-speed rail a lot of capacity on the longer distance network to get freight from anywhere in Britain and where there's high-speed rail to the edge of London. But it's going to need something else to enable it to get across London, which is important because there are ports, and there's the Channel Tunnel in particular, which carries less freight than the train ferries in the great old days when you loaded train wagons on ferries, and then run out of carriage. I mean, this is just not work. So it should work, but it doesn't. So there's a lot of risk and uncertainty. Your second question was totally unrelated, actually, and I forgot what it was, Harry.
The energy base.
The energy base question. Yeah, interestingly enough, the railway runs, as it happens, it runs on pretty much nuclear generated electricity at the moment, but of course it can be scored as that, because if it, argument is if it wasn't using that, it was using coal-fired power stations. So it's always scored on the basis of using the carbon quotient that comes out of the average energy supply. Railways account for, it's below 1% of the total energy electric power supply in the country, and roughly half the network is electrified already. So this isn't going to make much difference to national power consumption. So it isn't a question of really what do we have to, do we need another nuclear power station? No, you don't. But clearly one has to look at where's the energy, what's the energy mix going to be in the electrical supply industry. There's one other thing that I think is worth thinking about, which we talked about in the manifesto, which is if you're going to build something, do you look hard at other utilities that are probably going to be in difficulty through lack of truck capacity? And I mean, a few years ago we would have been fibre optics everywhere in Britain. But there is still a north-south water issue, which many people say can't be solved by pumping water. But the truth of the matter is the southeast of England is desperately short of water. Answer, drink less water. That's what the water industry will tell you. The north of the country is awash with rain, which is kind of handy. We have no system of getting it from one end to the other. We've had systems of getting the rain in Wales to the Midlands of England for 70, 80 years. It works perfectly well. So if you're going to carve up the countryside, we should be thinking about that. We should also be thinking about this problem of smart grids for electricity and the difficulty of getting electricity generated in wave and wind power in the north and west of the country into the rest of the country. Because otherwise we're going to be building pylons or digging mini tunnels and sticking wires with heat sinks. So you're going to make it a super mega project. Do you have those? Hyper mega project.
Jim, can I ask, first of all I should apologise, I suppose, for being an economist.
Yes. I think so.
But one of the big issues, you touched on road car prices.
Yes.
But it's the structure of that price. The fact that the motorist pays so much up front,
yes,
in terms of tax, car tax, insurance, and sort of annual servicing costs, that then makes the marginal cost of the mile is basically, okay, the petrol, the oil, and a bit of wear and tear. And the structure for rail is that you pay a much fuller cost,
yes,
per marginal mile.
Yes.
Is there, it's the problem the government, again, the government might put money in, and there's the dead end of the treasury. But actually what we need to say to people in some modified form is you have already paid for a lump of the railways. Therefore, you have a credit for, I don't know, so many miles. I mean, you tell me how it works or it doesn't, which would actually encourage people to use the capacity that they've got free of charge or at a reduced cost, whatever, which would then try and redress the balance between the pricing system of the car and the pricing system that the consumer faces for railways.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a very important area, and I have to say the current actual and perceived set of prices, particularly system, all the rest of it for railways, is a real negative in trying to convince people high-speed rail's a good idea. Because one, they say, well, geez, well, I mean, it already costs 300 quid, so they've been told, to go from London to Manchester. Actually, £375 if you buy first class open return ticket. So this will be even more expensive, won't it? So, of course, the average fare paid between London and Manchester is probably about 40 quid. I mean, it's just a complete utter shambles, and in my view, the rail industry has totally failed to sort it out. And so something government has to do, whether it's along the lines you say. I mean, you could get back to the same revenue take to government and actually have a system that feels a lot cheaper than it is, put it that way. I also tend to feel with the highway network, with the private car transport system, we desperately do have to do something, because I think road user charge is still a long, long way away. I mean, the joke always used to be it's 10 years away, and actually it's 10 years away. So, because of technology, well, we know it's technologically doable, but it's kind of 10 years away, sort of, is a very double-edged problem, because so it is going to happen. Oh, yeah. I mean, nobody will ever say it's not going to happen, and therefore it blights proper thinking about more expedient measures, more politically acceptable measures. And it was very disappointing that it's now Aviva, Norwich Union's insurance scheme, which was a pay insurance per mile scheme, was abandoned. That would be, and I mean, don't see why government couldn't legislate, give some warning it was going to do so, take a few years to introduce it, to require that all private car insurance is mileage based and time of travel based, and they're charging more if you're driving your car late at night, you're far more likely to have an accident. I can't see what the problem with that is. And people who used it found it great, because if they use their cars less, they save money. And there's nothing at the moment like that around. But expedient devices like that, I think we're doing this. And you can build on it, because actually to make it work, you have to have a little black box fitted. So if you could get, I mean, which after all is the big objection to road user charging is the Big Brother thing, actually. So you're right, it's a big issue.
Given that the next few years is going to be spent in trying to ditch as many projects as possible in order to try and bring the national debt into some form of shape, prospects then for a project such as a high-speed rail, be it 2, 3, 4, whatever, look remote unless it can be associated with a wider agenda. Now, I know you are on record, Jim, in speaking to another audience of saying, look, if you want projects of this kind go ahead, you've got to think of it in terms of a much wider agenda that can be accomplished as a result of achieving this one project. What I'm intrigued to hear your views on is to what extent, given that across the government machinery projects are going to be ditched as fast as they can be, subject to the political will, to what extent can a high-speed rail project be associated very strongly and linked with other critical agendas that will keep it as a possibility that it will be started.
When the credit crunch broke, people started saying to me, because soon after the sort of the bank took it out, people started talking about Keynes suddenly, and they got their old textbooks out. So they probably carried them with them all the time. and people were saying to me, actually, this is good for it's good news for high speed rail. You know, it's a classic. This is a disaster. This is really seriously bad. My own hope would be that some kind of thinking building along the lines that Peter was talking about how are we going to rebuild the economy in the country, which then people start to realise actually requires businesses. You need people in the private sector to do things. So then people say, well, so what's the role of the public sector? Well, actually stay out of the way, is what business will tell you. Don't tax me. Give me a free hand to plan things, do things right. Somehow conjuring that into a form that will work and direct investment, I think is the best hope, coupled with the view that governments that face up to, I would say, the fact, going right back to the beginning, our transport system is one of the great inhibitors to economic development. And this happens to be something that doesn't damage the other great project going on, which is tackling the environmental problem. But it's a hell of a tall order to get people to do that. Why did the Tories come out and say? Because they wanted to do something different from Labour. They wanted to win votes. They wanted to make themselves popular. And, Cameron's got a kind of greenness about it.
Sorry, you go on. Yeah.
No, just leading on from that, I mean, given when the Conservatives came out with this idea of having this project from high-speed rail from London through Birmingham, Manchester to Leeds, and soon thereafter, you then found the current government saying, oh, perhaps we need to look at this, and Andrew Adonis was moved from education into transport. Reputedly, it's meant to be a rail enthusiast. So, I mean, he's been sort of charged and set up this new company under Sir David Rowland to look at it. But it does seem to me that what the current government is doing is very much latching onto an idea that the opposition party was putting forward, and they thought that might possibly be a vote winner.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Don't forget, it was connected with this Heathrow issue. The Tories announced it. They said, and we are going to not only not build Heathrow runway through, they said anybody stupid enough to work for BAA on it will be on the blacklist, which is a little harsh.
But now this gets really interesting because, as far as you can judge, I think, you must have met him several times, John, I've met him a couple of times. He's really sincere in his promotion of rail, although it's actually politically advantageous. And it should be said that plans for high-speed rail produced at the end of 2009 cost very little. I don't know what Sir David Rowland charges out today, but it doesn't cost very much. And the investment is going to come sometime in the 2020s, maybe, so they can. You and I would like it sooner, but I mean, there's the issue. So politically, it's quite astute just before a general election. However, the point I wanted to make is that yesterday we had Richard Branson brightly announcing he put $1 billion into high speed to the northwest. It wasn't quite clear from the description in the FT what he meant, where he meant your line, Jim, or speeding up the existing west coast, but $1 billion but by quite a lot of rail. But he said if I can get a 20-year franchise. Now this gets interesting because you mentioned the long franchise issue in relation to the East Coast. And I think this could become an issue because, as you'll know, Andrew Adonis asked Chris Green and me to look at train stations. And immediately in the conversation last night, this issue came up that the TOCs won't invest in them. they won't invest in anything. You know, they might buy some, forced to buy some trains, but they certainly won't make major station improvements. So either you transfer the lot to Network Rail, or you let longer franchises. It gets quite interesting. But the other aspect is, if you go a long way back to the 1960s, the French, who've been doing economic planning ever since 1946, I mean, that system, which was very resilient, rested on the state saying every 4 years, we're going to pump in this and this and this, as an indication to private sector to go with them. And that worked very well for a long time. In a glorious 30 years, it worked perhaps a bit less well afterwards. And one wonders whether this involvement of big shot entrepreneurs like Richard Branson couldn't be an answer as part of a concerted strategy.
It's just a final point, because it's very, very clear from the work that we're doing, certainly the CISO around the Tenerife, that if you examine the history of the project, that the definition of the project from the outset is not what the project is in reality today. And that if you look at international rail developments throughout the world, they're not making profits on the line haul part. It has to be associated with real estate, has to be associated with related infrastructure. And to the cost of the government, whether it be Thames Gateway, whether it be St Pancras, they've actually put in the money already. So in a way, in practice, they're doing what the French do, except the French actually have it as a policy, and the British government is doing it by accident. So what I don't understand is why can't rail projects be defined in broader terms, and only then will they really see the light, which is really what you're saying. Until such time that happens, either with the dead hand of the Treasury or with the Department of Transport, and if you get this fragmentation, there's no way a holistic view is going to be pursued.
Well, it's a very interesting observation. I mean, Sir David has already said, well, I think one of the ways in which we could tackle funding this, and incidentally, I mean, my initial view was rather sceptical, because as Permanent Secretary, you do spend an awful lot of time trying to convince people with wacky ideas to go away. So I really thought, you know,
is this referring to you or me?
Yeah, what could be. No, I think that you know, he has already said that one way of looking at funding this will be to provide for an associated profit. We're already doing it. But I think your observation is right. We don't really like admitting this, and why not? What we did. I mean, what you've described is a sort of intellectualisation of the issue. We don't like that. The Treasury doesn't like it appearing to be something that's a precedent, or even worse, it's a new policy that they can't control. So, yeah, we will do it, actually, but we won't admit we're doing it. Whereas the French will model, we're doing it because that's what we decided to do. We don't worry about it.
And I believe the Americans might well lead that way. I think America, but that's speculation. I think that the infrastructure stimulus program could offer a step change if there was culture in Britain to do that. I think.
But there isn't. You see, we've already had a fiscal. Right. We've had a fiscal stimulus package, believe it or not.
I didn't notice it.
Well, one characteristic certainly is there was nothing on rail in it. I mean, they dressed up a few.
Expanding to
well, then that's a bit wrong down. Now, what they clearly could have been is an announcement on railway electrification, which is kind of doing the rounds. Certainly a good thing to do, just cost money. But you get a return on it. No, it's not there. And that's because Treasury doesn't believe in this.
And in fact, some of the other thing I'm doing, the things like, I'm getting a fairly small bit, but regional funding allocations, where they've all been chipped up. Most of the extras going to roads, most of it was going to roads already anyway, I think. Which...
Well, the feature of that whole fiscal stimulus, which is surely completely farcical, is that they wanted projects that would start immediately. So what you got was the A11 duelling in Suffolk, which is ready to go tomorrow morning. I mean, by definition, anything more ambitious is out.
Oh yeah, and road. I think Jim will correct me if I'm sort of talking a load of rubbish, but I think this bias could hold that actually it's always more road programmes carefully lined up, whereas rails tend to have problems, so that you can take roads off the shelf, as it were.
Jim, is there a positive conclusion you could provide us here, quickly, before we all go home terribly depressed?
No, I don't think it's depressed at all. I think it's absolutely stunning. I mean, look, we have here the party that's most likely to form the next government.
Right.
I can't think of any other spending commitment it's made. Now, commitment. What the hell's a commitment? Oh, we've just opened the books, there's no money. But, you know, as Peter says, yeah, but you can spend a few years planning how to spend it, because you can't avoid that. You know, there isn't any option. You know, don't go and produce a report saying mega projects are bad and publish it. I mean, there isn't much opposition to this. So, we're just a bunch of old farts, really, telling you, you know, that this country doesn't quite run the way you might want it to run, but so what? I mean, for once we managed to do the right thing despite that. And we've got to do the right thing despite that right across the piece on energy as well.
That's right.
And the sort of the national, I don't know, because something that's called a national spatial policy, I can't believe we'll have one. We might have something else that just doesn't sound quite so prescriptive, you know. And then we might actually get the benefits that we need out of it.
Well, thank you very much. I'm positive too in looking ahead, but we need to look back and
We do.
Yeah,
We've got to learn things.
Right.
And you're going to help us do that.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much.